Thank you very much, Mr. David Razanovsky, for your insights and your speech. So now starting off with the panel. The first panel of the day is titled Nurturing New Ideas. Organizations that assist new companies and discuss the value proposition of each type of working relationship. For our panelists, we have a cast of professionals who understand the value of partnerships. We have Dr. Khalid Al-Ali, who is the Executive Director of University of California's of NASA Partnerships, and he also founded the Silicon Valley Business Roundtable in 2009. He has an extensive background in creating opportunities for collaboration between universities, government, and industry. Next, we have Mr. Thomas Atkinson, who is currently the board chair and director of Mavericks Civilian Space Foundation. He has over 25 years of experience as an entrepreneur and technologist, and his ventures range from semiconductors and mobile computing to healthcare and aerospace. Then we have Mr. Alexander McDonald, who leads the NASA's emerging commercial space office as program executive within the Office of Chief Technologist. He serves at NASA through an intergovernmental personal agreement with Carnegie Mellon University, where he is a research faculty member. Then we have Mr. Sean Mahoney, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Maston Space Systems. He has extensive business experience in building organizations in emerging technology fields. From large established corporations to the earliest of startups, Mr. Mahoney bridges the gap between technology and business. The moderator for this panel is Mr. Amarash Kolipara, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Earth to Orbit LLC, which is working with the Indian Space Research Organization to provide commercial services to a variety of satellite clients. He also co-produced the first and second annual Space Venturing Forum, an entrepreneurial event hosted by the National Space Society. Please welcome Mr. Amarash Kolipara and the panel.
I promise there's not just a one-person panel.
Mr. McDonald seems to be running late, so he'll be joining as soon as he arrives.
He just got it.
He just went to the restroom.
Yeah, he just got it. Well, thank you for the introduction, Curtis. We're going to have one more panelist who's going to arrive in a minute. So the topic of the panel today is nurturing innovation. And the theme, as Curtis mentioned earlier, is centered around how private enterprise, government, universities, and other entities can partner in many ways, in many fashion, to basically nurture, catalyze, and foster industry growth. So I think each one of us is going to spend a few minutes just kind of giving a background on how our experience fits and is synergistic with the theme. Then we'll launch into questions, and we'll take questions from the audience as well. So very briefly, I think Curtis mentioned my background, but I think the main theme, I usually like to talk about it using analogies. And so the analogy I usually mention when this topic comes up is the internet and the growth of the internet. So as most of you know, that back in the 70s and 80s, government investment created the foundation of what we call the infrastructure of the internet today. So DoD investments, university investments, led to the precursors of the internet like ARPANET and other derivatives. And that foundation that government catalyzed, that foundation is basically what formed the crux or the foundation of commercial enterprise of the internet later on. Sounds like we have another audience member in the background. So imagine the foundation that was set by ARPANET and other things through the 80s was essentially utilized by commercial industry in the 90s and transformed into what the internet is today. It's basically a society transforming industry. It impacts each and every one of your lives drastically. All made true, or at least the precursors of it made true, through government involvement back in the 70s and 80s. Now, if the government was not involved back then, I would argue that the internet would still have taken maybe a decade or more to get to where it is today. Or it may be actually the use of it and the infrastructure of it and the catalyzation of it may be entirely different how we see it today. So industry and government and universities and other entities don't often work in vacuums, but they actually often work in collaborative fashions, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes very directly. But any innovation and commercial growth rarely takes place in a vacuum. So I'll turn it over to Sean.
Sean Mahoney with Mast Space Systems. I have the pleasure of representing industry on this panel. When the topic came up about fostering, nurturing innovation, I thought, well, this is a great topic. It lines up pretty well with how I came to be in the space industry. My background had nothing to do with space. I watched launches on TV, and that was about the extent of it. But I spent a lot of time working with other emerging companies, specifically around Georgia Tech and some technology that was coming out of there. And it is through a series of partnerships, some of which succeeded and some which didn't, led me to meet the folks that then brought me into Maston. So I sit here today as personification of how partnerships can lead to successes. For those that are thinking about innovation and think, well, this is great, we've got this conference, we're going to figure out how to solve all these great problems, all we need is a really good idea, I would offer a word of caution that the great idea is not enough. And nurturing innovation is really hard. We have, as human beings, a cognitive bias that we want to always be successful. And innovation is about failure. It's about embracing failure. In the industry we hear often overused, failure is not an option. The second half of the sentence is, it's a requirement. It's different when you've got people whose lives are on the line, but when you're talking about trying to build a business, you've got to accept failure as one of the things that's going to happen. And so in terms of nurturing, if you're thinking about working in a small business and trying to solve all the world's problems, realize that as a leader and as a manager, your job is going to be to facilitate the team members embracing failure as a way to succeed, as a way to manifest that innovation. So we'll talk a little bit more about the partnership ideas, but that's my high-level thoughts on innovation.
My name is Tom Atchison, and I'm with the Maverick Civilian Space Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization that's really focused on trying to facilitate many folks who are interested in innovating in this space. My background, I grew up here in the Valley, early days, even before there was a semiconductor, well, not quite before there was a semiconductor industry, but pretty close to that. I spent my whole career in small emerging companies and innovating technologies in the PC industry, the internet industry, mobile wireless communications, and then tried to take what I learned in starting companies and working with startups and pioneering technologies there and try to apply that to try to accelerate the pace of innovation in the space industry. There were many great pioneers at the time when I started getting involved with space in 2000 that were doing really cutting-edge stuff even before I came to the scene. Bob Twiggs at Stanford was doing remarkable things with CanSats and CubeSats. We had a culture in the Valley here that had always had a kind of deep passion for space. But space businesses are quite different than a .com or even some of these computer enterprise companies in that the risk timelines are much longer, and the capitalization requirements are generally much higher. And so innovating in those environments, and particularly with a commercial company, is really, really tough because it's very difficult to both manage risk and get the resources that you need. And so we thought, well, let's see if we can play a catalyzing role as a nonprofit by dealing with the common items that people need and then trying to help embrace and accelerate the early adopters. The Valley here with ideas really was driven by the early adopters who would get together and wire wrap 68,000s and try to share register interfaces for software components when they didn't have specs to try to move an idea forward. And so that, I think, is a very crucial component of driving innovation. And really, it also gets to the aspect of risk and the ability to take risk. If you want to go have a great idea and actually try to convert it into something and maybe then apply it to innovate a new way or a new process, particularly in space, to accomplish something, you have to have the ability to take that risk. And the people around you that you depend upon also have to have the ability to take that risk. And it gets a little bit to some of the failure items that you were mentioning, but I like to think of it more as kind of controlled risk-taking. And how do you have partnerships and collaborations and relationships and supporting organizations that can assist with reducing the risk, which effectively reduces your capitalization costs, which helps you then eventually get your market and get your business up into the market quicker. And so we've worked with Pentagon, we've worked with NASA. Those are continuing to develop. We look for early adopters, both at the university level, where you find the students with the most ability to take risk, because they don't have mortgages and families and homes and all that kind of stuff. So you see a lot of innovation coming out of university environments. So we try to embrace them because they don't have a lot of experience, and all of us in this room have ever done anything, even flying a balloon, let alone rockets or launch vehicles or even spacecraft. There's a wealth of knowledge and a repository of it, both within the government as well as within our aerospace sector. We work with aerospace engineers who are in large companies who've had great ideas that could innovate, but because of the model of the commercial aerospace sector, capital, if the contract's up, that's it, baby. The project's closed. There's a lot of IP that's sitting out there from closed contracts. Huge opportunity for new innovation areas. But you're going to need assistance. You're going to need launch infrastructure. You're going to need experience with regulatory permitting and insurance. And there's a whole slew of things that add huge amounts of cost burden on small companies. And a nonprofit organization has some advantages in operating in that area and facilitating some of those services to both drive innovation, but also through trying out and doing research and early development, provide huge educational opportunities for priming the pump of the next generation of innovators that are going to come along. And that's another big objective. So we're basically trying to facilitate and help research through education, and that's the primary role that we deal with there. And we think it's pretty important in actually trying to get innovation to move forward. So.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex McDonald. I am the program executive for NASA's Emerging Commercial Space Office, which is a new function within the Office of the Chief Technologist that does research and analysis, studies and assessments on the emerging commercial space industry, which of course is the principal subject here at NewSpace. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today. A little bit about my background to preface my comments is that I'm an economic historian. And when I look at what's happening today in the space industry, I see a lot of very interesting historical precedents and parallels. And first off, it's very interesting that we're starting here talking about partnerships because one of NASA's most recent and stunning successes has come through a partnership with the private sector, which of course was the successful delivery of cargo, or at least the demonstration of the capability to deliver cargo to the ISS by SpaceX with the COTS program. And that's a really major milestone, and I think it's really going to be kicking off a return to an earlier model that existed for people who are interested in exploring space prior to the Cold War. Because if you go back to the real origins of spaceflight in America. In the 19th century, you had a lot of individuals who were thinking about how this might be achieved. And without exception, up until the 1890s, they all thought it was going to be done by the private sector alone, by individuals with resources, with the technical skills to put together their own particular spacecraft. Now, these were often rather fanciful. They would be really kind of, steam boilers with girding and ways to generate oxygen inside this. We're talking the 1860s here, right? So give them some credit. But it was quite interesting that in about 1890, we got the first mention of a public-private partnership for spaceflight. And this was by a gentleman named John Jacob Astor IV. And he was heir to the Astor fortune. And in his 30s, he decided that he would write a book called A Journey in Other Worlds. And in this book, he described a future where the idle billionaires of I think it was about the 23rd century, had solved most of the problems on the planet, and they decided they would go off into space. And they asked Mr. Eralt, who is the kind of stand-in for the young Mr. Astor, well, this is a great idea. Perhaps we could go to Congress and get an appropriation for this under the promotion of science, which was something the Congress would do. And he said, no, I will do this myself, but I will go to the government for technical advice and for logistical support from the Navy for launch, which is very interesting because this is the 1890s, and that's the first mention of a public-private partnership for spaceflight. And that technical advice part starts to approach what, of course, the NACA did, which was NASA's predecessor organization, for the development of early flight. And so then you started to have spaceflight technology develop as a public-private partnership. Robert Goddard would have funding from the Guggenheims, but also have the support of the NACA. Lewis, for whom Lewis Research Center used to be named before it was renamed the Glenn Research Center, helped him test his models in the wind tunnels. And that was the way in which Goddard developed his early liquid fuel rocketry technology as a public-private partnership. And so as we move into the 21st century and away from the Cold War origins of NASA, I think we're increasingly coming to re-embrace the American entrepreneurial spirit and re-embrace the notion of public-private partnership as a fundamental way of driving forward innovation in the space industry. So I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. My name is Khalid Al-Ali, and I'm the Executive Director of the UC Office of NASA Partnerships. I also wear other hats. One is I'm the founder of the Silicon Valley Space Business Roundtable. Some of you have known about our organization. It's a nonprofit. And sit on a few boards of companies, some of them in aerospace, and I've spun off a few as well. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to see the turnout for NewSpace. This is an exciting time for all of us, and a wonderful panel with exciting discussions. So thank you for having me. I share the same sentiment that you've been hearing so far by my colleagues here on the panel. There's kind of an operative word of partnership. Let me rephrase that. Basically what we're saying is that we need each other. It's well and good to have innovation, but when you have innovation and nurturing new ideas in the face of economic uncertainty, that changes things. You can see right away, many investments go away, investors go away. They're not interested in long runways and long valleys of death, especially when there's tremendous upfront capital investment needed and tremendous risk, which is the nature of NewSpace. Well, then I can't imagine a better place to start these kinds of ideas other than Silicon Valley. It's why the Silicon Valley Space Business Roundtable is here. Because if there's one culture that understands how to tackle risk, this is it. But then I'll share with you a perspective from my journey that got me to here. I started out as a Berkeley grad engineer, excited about space, and put shuttle payloads in space. And then followed a journey that thrust me into a variety of structures, organizational structures, whether it's the government. I used to be a government official, both state and at the country level, my home country, but stayed here in California. Idea that is to learn how these things work and not work. Worked in private industry, worked in nonprofits, and a pattern starts to emerge. The pattern simplifies to great ideas start by connecting good people with other good people and put them in an organizational structure or in an environment in which there's open mind share and the idea of fostering creativity across the board. And then from there, you create impact. Most successful startups are that way. No one went and recruited through an HR department the best computer engineer with regards to search to start Google. That's not how that started. The same we see here. Folks who are my colleagues in this panel, and you as well, this is how they connect with others, folks that they trust, folks who they call good people, because they're sticking their necks out. Their livelihoods are at stake. And as a consequence, they can't afford to just have just talent. They need to know where these people stand when it comes to marching forward. So then I focused on organizations or starting organizations and engaging in innovating the organizational structure itself. One of the biggest gifts of Silicon Valley culture of innovation are not the products and services that they produce, but the business process innovation that they were involved in. You have folks who show up at 7 in the morning, folks who show up at 12, and somehow this company still can walk a metronome and deliver on schedule. That's really has been a point of excitement for me, as even though I'm an engineer, because I figured that that's what makes the organization go round and makes it successful. From there, the need arises that in light of shortage of resources, and let's be actually more specific, shortage of cash, there's not as much shortage of resources, there's a shortage of cash. You heard about a lot of the bottled up IP because of canceled programs. These are resources, sunk costs that are there. They're ripe for the taking. And all it takes for someone to know where they are and take them. In my endeavors with NASA as a researcher there, during the FY04 tough times at Ames, which is 2003, 2004, they almost shut down over there. They didn't have money to spend, barely to keep their folks afloat. So instead, the dialogue turned into, let's share resources. You have underutilized resources available to us, and we have underutilized resources available to you, and let's do a resource exchange. Nonprofits are ideal environment for that. They are allowed by law to do that. For-profits have a little tougher time. And that then would be peppered with a modicum of cash that is fully leveraged by these underutilized resources. And now you have yourself a program and you start running. So I'll stop here since this is just a brief introduction. We'll leave it to the Q&A to discuss this further. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. I think the next phase of our panel is we're going to go into kind of more of a Q&A type thing. And we're going to open up questions to the audience as well. So please think about questions. We'll open that up in a few minutes now. And I assume there's going to be a mic floating around. So think of good questions. The panel itself today it has good representation from commercial industry, from NASA, from universities, as well as nonprofit, what I would call early stage incubators. So we have a good representation across the full gamut of potential collaborative partnerships and interaction between the three entities we're talking about, government, universities, and commercial enterprise. So I would like to start off the questions with, this may be an edgy question, so maybe to wake up the audience a bit. And Alex, this is coming to you. Hope that's okay. Okay, so we talked about, I think you mentioned, Alex, earlier on that one of the NASA programs, specifically COTS and the derivatives of it, have led to I think, one of the most monumental and historic occurrences over the last few months, the SpaceX Dragon docking at the space station. I guess the question is, can you comment more about the interaction between NASA and SpaceX? And the direct question behind that is, would SpaceX be where it is today without NASA?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I've had no personal involvement with the NASA SpaceX interactions, so my information is as good as anyone else who reads the news and the various reports. But it's pretty clear that NASA had a critical role in both providing the early investments for the technology, and Elon himself has made it very clear that he sees NASA as a very critical partner, not just for the COTS program, but for having actually created the industrial base on which he could build. Because one thing that's very critical about SpaceX, and this is just my personal opinion here, is that they've had the ability to do kind of what Kelly Johnson did for the Skunk Works, which was that you could really take the broader aerospace industry and find some of the very, very best and brightest and attract them into an environment in which they could work on projects that were very well technically directed and very well motivated. And that's worked very, very well. Now, you can't do that unless you have a broader industry on which to build. And I think you only need to go to Elon's own comments that he sees NASA as having really enabled this critically, both in terms of technology, in terms of creating the COTS program itself, in terms of creating an actual thriving American aerospace industry for the last 50 years. And I think that's very critical. I mean, NASA is going to be an important partner for anyone considering exploring space in the future, I think. That's an opinion. I think that's just going to be a practical decision that a lot of entrepreneurs are going to make. And I think that's very encouraging. So I don't know if anyone else takes a crack at that.
Any other comments on that, or should we can move on to another question? No? Okay. I completely agree. I think over the history, NASA's history, over its 50-plus year history, NASA has spent a little above $800 billion in today's dollars, and that has led to all that money has been, well, some of that money has been spent well, and has led to decent and very impressive intellectual property. And so NASA right now, it seems like to me, is acting as, is wearing many hats. It's serving as a customer to private enterprise. It's serving as a intellectual property commercialization engine for commercial enterprise. It's acting as a catalyst for commercial enterprise as well. So it's wearing many critical hats that I think is fostering growth in the industry quite well.
Yeah, I do want to put in one plug for an Ames colleague and a colleague at the Emerging Commercial Space Office who, of course, actually transferred and developed the initial heat shield technology, PICA, which SpaceX used on Dragon for reentry. And this really is a classic example of NASA in the NACA mold, right? Developing a technology which has broad application to the industry as a whole, and then transferring it freely to industry. And that's a great example, and we need to be aware of that and see how we can extend those examples in the future. Dan spent a lot of time going down. You don't just transfer technology by licensing patents. That's not how technology is transferred. Right? Technology transferred through person-to-person interactions, through codified knowledge, and often through reverse engineering as well. But in this case, it was Dan going down and working directly with SpaceX over a course of many, many months and transferring the know-how and the technology that had been developed at NASA to SpaceX, which was absolutely critical. And we need to see more of that.
One of my roles in the industry is working as the managing director of Earth to Orbit, which is a company that works with the Indian Space Agency. So among many things that we do is we actually mine the intellectual property of the Indian Space Agency to find intellectual property that can be commercialized and eventually brought to market either through startups or through licensing and that effect. But we found that we're only skimming the surface. There's mountains of very cool stuff going on in the space agency over there, and I think we've only accessed maybe 0.1% of it. So this is leading to a question for Khalid, actually. Khalid, what is the mechanism that you and maybe your colleagues use to find nuggets or kernels or interesting things going on in the UC system, and how that may be brought forth in a collaborative partnership with NASA? So how do you find the cool projects? How do you find the cool IP? And how does that come to the surface?
Alex touched on that. I think that, of course, University of California is a massive institution. Just to give you some numbers, to give you an idea of scale, their budget is 19 billion a year. There's 183,000 employees and faculty there, and 235,000 students in 10 campuses and 3 national labs. It's quite a bit bigger than NASA, just to give you an idea of perspective. And it's a state institution, so it has its complexities and such. So to mine the papers that are being published is a daunting task, and actually much of what you see on paper is not exactly what's going on in the labs. So the answer to that, and not just mining the intellectual output of the university, but also NASA, is primarily through the person-to-person interaction. Foreknowledge of the cutting-edge work that goes on in the various labs and facilities, and dialogue that would connect the chains that would get you to these low-hanging fruits. Of course, it's quite laborious. It would probably just leave it to someone to figure out a artificial intelligence engine that could actually mine this data and be able to find these little nuggets and then go and explore there. But so far, that's how it's been done. Of course, both of these institutions are currently suffering massive budget cuts. And as such, there's insufficient staffing to be able to look at the entirety of the spectrum of what the output is. And it changes week to week. You get big, I mean, these are massive institutions and they're constantly moving. So a snapshot that's last month may be very outdated next month.
Can you maybe mention a few what you think would be or currently are the interesting projects that are in partnership between the UC and NASA? What are some examples?
So at the forefront of the current relationship, there's an existing one called the University Affiliated Research Center. That's a federally funded national lab, if you may. It's not as big as Livermore, but it's still $300-some million. I ran that for a year. And they do cutting-edge work when it comes to aerospace research, when it comes to information sciences, when it comes to robotics and so forth. But the emerging connections that we're seeing within UC have to do at the very forefront of biology. So there's a big push for that, whether it's synthetic or otherwise. A big push towards advancements in supercomputing, and also a big push towards advancements in quantum computing. So these are the various new embryonic connections that are being formed as we speak, and within the university there are institutes being conceived and considered for that. Of course, you have the usual cohort of astrobiologists and astronomers. There's a very strong connection given Ames here and Kepler. Keep in mind that the nearest two centers, if you may, between these big institutions is Ames Research Center on the NASA side, University of California, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz. Those are the two on the UC side. So obviously this area here, this location here, is the place where the main interface happens. So that's why you're seeing a lot of that connection. And because Ames is the home for Kepler, looking for Earth-like planets outside our solar system, there's a very strong connection there with the astronomers and astrophysicists within UC.
Khalid's comment actually brought up in my mind another analogy. So we talked about the internet earlier. Another analogy is the dawn of the biotech age. And I think the beginning of the biotech industry is actually, the foundation of it is, in the root of it actually is a wonderful synergy between government, universities, and the private industry. So in the mid to late 70s, the NIH, government organization, funded research projects at UCSF, a university, and private venture capital came in and helped found Genentech. So the biotechnology industry today, I think, was essentially born out of the partnership of three distinct entities that we're talking about today. Sean, I wanted to kind of bring in the commercial sector point of view. So I wonder if you can comment on how Maston is currently working with NASA and universities, and what specific intellectual property or what specific projects are you working on with those two other entities?
Happy to comment. First of all, let me ask a quick question. Of the folks that are in the audience, how many of you, you get to put yourself in one of three buckets, or all three if you want, how many are in or want to be in a small company that's doing innovative space stuff? Bucket two is you're in a big organization and you're trying to foster innovation in your world. And the third is people who are waiting for buckets 1 and 2 to hurry up and get some cool stuff done because you want the benefits of innovation. So how many are in bucket 1? Okay. How many are in bucket 2? Excellent. How many are in bucket 3? All right, that's all right. It's good to know who we're talking to. So we got a little bit of each. All right, so thank you. In terms of what is Maston doing in the partnership range, it is absolutely imperative to a commercial entity to be working with other people. There is no such thing as, to my mind, as innovation absent a transaction. There has to be someone who can benefit from that innovation, otherwise you're just a crazy guy in a shed. So we work very closely with NASA Flight Opportunities Program. Does anyone not know Flight Opportunities Program here? Okay, good. So we're a selectee on the Flight Opportunities Program, a slightly different approach than perhaps the traditional aerospace, where we're only getting paid when we deliver a flight. We don't get paid for development. Our incentive is very clearly fly and then get paid. And so it's a slightly different way than some of the traditional ways that government has interacted with industry. We're also working with a number of different universities as payloads and as sources of development talent. We have a number of challenges that we're trying to solve. It might be in the landing side, it could be in the altitude side, and we'll work with universities that have expertise. We'll co-develop proposals, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we work with a university that has a particular area of expertise and leverage that along with our flying vehicles to provide benefit to both. And we've had a lot of success and there's a lot of interest. It also takes a lot of work. There's a lot of time that has to go into writing proposals. So if you're in that first bucket of wanting to work in a small company, make sure you or someone you're working with knows how to write proposals. And I'll give you a free tip here. Probably shouldn't, but I will anyway. Always, always, always ask for the debrief. If you submit a proposal and you get told no, ask why. If you get told yes, absolutely ask why. So don't tell anyone else. But we do an awful lot both with universities, with nonprofit organizations, and with NASA, and we couldn't be here today. We couldn't be alive if it weren't for folks that see that benefit. And then, of course, obviously, the last piece of that is we do a lot of work with other commercial entities that are going to benefit from what we're doing, and they make more money off of our collaboration than they pay to us. So that's great.
Excellent, thank you. This brings up the notion, Sean, as you were talking, I was thinking about how relationships with the commercial enterprise tactically take place. And I imagine that when those relationships take place, a lot of ideas are shared between all the various parties involved. So given the litigious nature of our country, I was wondering how IP sharing might work in situations like that. And I was going to ask Tom, if you could comment on your experience. How does IP sharing, or the topic of IP, how is that handled on a tactical level with the various players involved?
Okay, thanks. So intellectual property is, it's a really, really tricky issue because particularly if you're an early stage company, it's the only thing you really have to leverage other than the people that you have to get your organization up. I mean, you know, we joke with I'm involved with teaching a venture entrepreneurship program in the graduate program. There's a group of us that do it at Stanford. And of course, we open the program up and say, how many people have a great idea? And of course, every student raises their hand because they're going to change the world. And we say, put your hand down. Nobody cares about great ideas. They're really interested in great opportunities. How many people have a great opportunity? Most people now are pretty little skittish. The challenge in innovation and trying to do this stuff is basically taking great ideas and converting them to great opportunities. And when you have a great opportunities, the capital markets are going to rush in to exploit it. Okay, let's just face it, capital markets in a capitalist system, they're all Ferenges. If you haven't seen the Ferengi rules, I encourage you to read them, especially before you go pitch a venture capitalist. It's the nature of who they are, you can't blame it. And you want it when you've got them on your side and they're invested there, it's a great asset. But, so our role in particular, we run into this all the time. The intellectual property piece is very important with getting your first round of investors, not because they think it's a great idea and it's going to be, you know, $1 billion company or whatever. the first investment. And then you save it for a rainy day, and then you get on with running your business, and of course then it's a huge distraction because you got to pay all these to continue to protect it as you disclose things and your competitors come in, and that is a whole other discussion. But what we try to do in a partnership collaborative environment is to say, look, particularly with space exploration and space technology, these are complicated systems, okay? I mean, this is where kind of systems engineering really hit its heyday. And there's probably within your IP the key pieces that are really going to be your competitive advantage, and they're going to be really the heart of who you are and how you're going to be successful. Keep that to yourself. Because aside from that, there's going to be other system components you're going to be dependent upon. If you have a new aperture technology or you have a new propulsion technology, you're still going to need an airframe, you're still going to need guidance, you're going to need these other components that are out there. Now, you may want to take one that somebody has that's a kind of a, we used to do this when we pioneered the smartphone with Microsoft. We ended up selling the company to Microsoft. And we had to figure out how we were going to put smartphones in people's pockets. And we had long discussions up in Redmond. We decided the best thing to do was to give everybody a hardware design to build on top of called a reference design. And the semiconductor industry does this a lot when they bring a new chip out. And that's a lot of what we try to do with the foundation, is to provide those platforms and then let you plug your piece in. That way we reduce the risk timelines, we help you get to that innovation faster and get to that opportunity faster. But it's a tricky line to walk. It's equally problematic in partnerships with the Defense Department. I mean, they have with SBIRs, I don't know how many people have been involved with SBIRs and trying to protect your intellectual property. It's supposed to be confidential. It's supposed to be kept away, and yet somehow, miraculously within the Pentagon and all of the large aerospace companies, it seems to manage to filter into your competitors. Be careful what you publish in patents. I mean, this is not just a direct issue. This is within the system where you feel like you can be trusted. So it's a very tricky area at the early stage because this is the real component that you have to leverage resources, right? I mean, entrepreneurship is the ultimate creative challenge because you've got to create something originally from nothing. I mean, you have an idea and you got to make it an opportunity and then get people excited about it and then get it capitalized and then make it real and then see if you can make money with it. So the IP pieces, we try to encourage people to keep that to themselves. We try to use outside counsel, right? So the first thing that happens, anybody wants to come talk to us about a new technology, the first thing we do is introduce them to a law firm. And we have them get complete advisement from their own legal counsel. Many of the law firms have packages, particularly if you have an interesting idea. They will help you defer your costs. Sometimes they'll give you a line or maybe take some shares down the road. I mean, you can work those deals out. But that's the best place to do it, is get legal counsel and then let the legal counsel manage your IP with their expertise that's there. And then share the components that benefit everybody, right? I mean, this is a lot like the westward movement. We're all charging off to California. If you go out on your own, you're likely going to get arrows in your back. Those pioneers didn't make it too long. That's why part of the reasons why we collaborate and partner. We've done it from the early days. But you have to depend upon each other. You need to put a barn up. Guess what? After church, everybody's going to go do a barn raising, right? And we have to share components and things together. We won't survive if we don't. So it's a tricky issue. But we try to stay out of the key items. We usually are pretty careful on identifying what they are up front. And so that's kind of one of the things that we've done with it.
And just to follow up on that, from Maston's standpoint, we do have proprietary technologies, but just because it's space doesn't mean it's patentable. We've come up with some phenomenal ideas. And you do a knockout patent search and found that there was a patent written in 1970, and it's like, oh, well, no one ever did this. There are phenomenal, you were talking about this earlier before the panel, there are phenomenal opportunities of things that are already out in the public domain. So definitely be aware of the IP, but don't feel like you have to be buttoned down and never say anything to anyone. Keep your core component, but if you're moving fast enough, you can stay ahead. If you keep coming up with new ways to solve a problem, it might not be patentable, but you can definitely build a business off that.
Yeah, one other comment, we were sharing tricks about things. With IP, if you're in an industry that's innovating really, really fast, think heavy and hard about how much resources you want to put into patents. Because you may have a patent on a technology that's obsolete, right? In the computer industry, in the internet industry, this was a big issue. A 17-year lock on a market doesn't do you any good if the market has been basically surpassed, because your technical evolution is moving so fast that you can't keep up with it. And yet, early stage, the most crucial component we all know is the cash you have. It's about getting to market that's crucial, right? And so patents and IP and stuff probably could have its own panel around it. But you should think, if you've got an idea that you want to patent, look at the pace with which that area of innovation is occurring and think carefully. It might be better to take that money and just run like hell with it, right? And try to get it to market as quick as you can and grab as many customers as you can before it's old and passed on. So.
Thank you. I think the end goal in these types of interactions between commercial enterprise, government, universities is to foster commercial viability and eventual adoption by, I think, the commercial market. So the five of us here are not commenting on government involvement in industry or in collaboration because we're all Marxist socialists. It's because there is an end game in mind. And I think if we break this up into kind of two buckets, involvement between the university, private sector, and government aids in research. It aids in also catalyzing commercialization. And I think the end game in mind is to hopefully foster commercial growth such that it can be sustainable without external input to a drastic degree. So with that, I'm going to try to open up questions from the audience. So if anyone has questions, please make yourself known, raise your hand. There's some mics floating around in the back. Yeah. Please go ahead.
To Alex. My name is Paul Masson. And Alex, my question is, preface and query. There's a group called the National Council of Public-Private Partnerships. It meets, it defines structures for it. Then it educates Congress, including things where you don't have to down select to a single company. And it also systematizes. What is NASA doing with NCPPP? And if NASA is not engaged, could that help NASA to promote what it's trying to do?
That's fascinating. First, I've heard of the organization, but yeah, it'd be great to discuss it and figure out what we can learn from it and how we can apply best practices, lesson learned, and all those wonderful things, and make sure NASA public partnerships are strong.
If it's the first you've heard of it, then here's the quick query. What would help you to educate Congress about PPPs?
I don't think I have a good answer to that, but I think that's a good question. And it's certainly a new era for these public-private partnerships. We're seeing increasing interest in them from all angles. And I think it's something we have to think through very carefully because there are many different ways to do public-private partnerships. And I think that's why I'm so interested in it. I mean, it's actually a rich intellectual question, how you set up these partnerships. You can go back to the early 20th century, right, where you had the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, which was a very interesting type of public-private partnership. And there are lots of other different types of models. And I think the community in general would do very well to become more aware of the different types of models and the different ways in which they can enable commercial development and different ways in which particular models can also disable commercial development. And I think that's a really important subject for research. And I think we all need to apply ourselves to at least somewhat.
We have a question here on the...
Hi, this is a question for Alex and any of the other panelists as well. Following up on the lessons learned idea, it's great to dispense advice about how you think things can be made to work, but it would be very interesting to hear those of you with experience in public-private partnership, not necessarily in space, but perhaps in similar industries, to give an example of something that everyone thought was a great idea and it didn't work, so that the young people, especially in the audience, and the people starting up can avoid making the same mistakes that have been made, in the recent or distant past.
How about some success stories first? Do you have any?
I have one that didn't work. I'll quickly, unless you do.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's it's a similar model that can be applied here, but it has to do with the government of India. But I think the anecdote is my company went in and essentially signed up a collaborative agreement with the Indian Space Agency. And the collaborative agreement was around licensing IP and eventually manufacturing IP through universities in India. But what we failed to realize, here's why it failed. It failed due to many reasons. But the main reason it failed is because the incentives of each party were different. And it's really hard to think through the incentives of each entity in the collaborative effort prior to the collaborative effort starting. So our incentive as a company was different from the Indian Space Agency's incentive, was different from the university's incentive. Our incentive was to make hardware and make a lot of money. And their incentive was to get, the Space Agency's incentive was to get publicity within the country such that it eventually will lead to more allocation of funding for the agency. And the university's incentive was to bring in more grad students in order to foster their grad students, the size and wherewithal of the grad program. So what we failed to understand is the timing around the incentives and how each incentive drove the milestones, the timing. So it fell apart because all the milestones were missed based on the incentives involved in each party. It's kind of a very broad answer to your question, but it's one that I think is overlooked a lot, is what's in it for each of the parties involved.
I'll try to come up with someone else's failures.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Curtis. We're going to have one more panelist who's going to arrive in a minute. So the topic of the panel today is nurturing innovation. And the theme, as Curtis mentioned earlier, is centered around how private enterprise, government, universities, and other entities can partner in many ways, in many fashion, to basically nurture, catalyze, and foster industry growth. So I think each one of us is going to spend a few minutes just kind of giving a background on how our experience fits and is synergistic with the theme. Then we'll launch into questions, and we'll take questions from the audience as well. So very briefly, I think Curtis mentioned my background, but I think the main theme, I usually like to talk about it using analogies. And so the analogy I usually mention when this topic comes up is the internet and the growth of the internet. So as most of you know, that back in the 70s and 80s, government investment created the foundation of what we call the infrastructure of the internet today. So DoD investments, university investments, led to the precursors of the internet like ARPANET and other derivatives. And that foundation that government catalyzed, that foundation is basically what formed the
Background had nothing to do with space. I watched launches on TV, and that was about the extent of it. But I spent a lot of time working with other emerging companies, specifically around Georgia Tech and some technology that was coming out of there. And it is through a series of partnerships, some of which succeeded and some which didn't, led me to meet the folks that then brought me into Maston. So I sit here today as personification of how partnerships can lead to successes. For those that are thinking about innovation and think, well, this is great, we've got this conference, we're going to figure out how to solve all these great problems, all we need is a really good idea, I would offer a word of caution that the great idea is not enough. And nurturing innovation is really hard. We have, as human beings, a cognitive bias that we want to always be successful. And innovation is about failure. It's about embracing failure. In the industry we hear often overused, failure is not an option. The second half of the sentence is, it's a requirement. It's different when you've got people whose lives are on the line, but when you're talking about trying to build a business, you've got to accept failure as one of the things that's going to happen.
crux or the foundation of commercial enterprise on the internet later on. Sounds like we have another audience member in the background. Imagine the foundation that was set by ARPANET and other things through the 80s was essentially utilized by commercial industry in the 90s and transformed into what the internet is today. It's basically a society transforming industry. It impacts each and every one of your lives drastically. All made true, or at least the precursors of it made true, through government involvement back in the 70s and 80s. Now, if the government was not involved back then, I would argue that the internet would still have taken maybe a decade or more to get to where it is today. Or it may be actually the use of it and the infrastructure of it and the catalyzation of it may be entirely different how we see it today. So industry and government and universities and other entities don't often work in vacuums, but they actually often work in collaborative fashions, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes very directly. But any innovation and commercial growth rarely takes place in a vacuum. So I'll turn it over to Sean.
Sean Mahoney with Mast and Space Systems. I have the pleasure of representing industry on this panel. When the topic came up about fostering, nurturing innovation, I thought, well, this is a great topic. It lines up pretty well with how I came to be in the space industry. My background.
Then we have Mr. Sean Mahoney, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Mast and Space Systems. He has extensive business experience in building organizations in emerging technology fields. From large established corporations to the earliest of startups, Mr. Mahoney bridges the gap between technology and business. The moderator for this panel is Mr. Amarash Kolipara, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Earth to Orbit LLC, which is working with the Indian Space Research Organization to provide commercial services to a variety of satellite clients. He also co-produced the first and second annual Space Venturing Forum, an entrepreneurial event hosted by the National Space Society. Please welcome Mr. Amarash Kolipara and the panel.
I promise there's not just a one-person panel.
Mr. McDonald seems to be running late, so he'll be joining as soon as he arrives.
He just got it.
He just went to the restroom.
Yeah, he just got it.
Thank you very much, Mr. David Razanovsky, for your insights and your speech. So now starting off with the panel. The first panel of the day is titled Nurturing New Ideas. Organizations that assist new companies and discuss the value proposition of each type of working relationship. For our panelists, we have a cast of professionals who understand the value of partnerships. We have Dr. Khalid Al-Ali, who is the Executive Director of University of California's of NASA Partnerships, and he also founded the Silicon Valley Business Roundtable in 2009. He has an extensive background in creating opportunities for collaboration between universities, government, and industry. Next, we have Mr. Thomas Atkinson, who is currently the board chair and director of Mavericks Civilian Space Foundation. He has over 25 years of experience as an entrepreneur and technologist, and his ventures range from semiconductors and mobile computing to healthcare and aerospace. Then we have Mr. Alexander McDonald, who leads the NASA's Emerging Commercial Space Office as program executive within the Office of Chief Technologist. He serves at NASA through an intergovernmental personal agreement with Carnegie Mellon University, where he is a research faculty member.